I first examined Dragon Quest XI back when it launched on PlayStation 4 over 2 years ago, but just a few weeks back, the Switch version finally launched. I'd nearly skipped this one, but followers of Digital Foundry encouraged us to give it a look, and I'm sure glad they did because this is one of the more impressive conversions I've yet encountered on Switch. It's true, there's a lot of sacrifices made here, but most of them are smart and subtle enough to avoid spoiling the experience. It still looks great. But there's more to this conversion than just visuals. Many additional tweaks and changes were made to the underlying gameplay and presentation, resulting in an even more enjoyable experience. So join me as we explore some of the changes made in bringing this massive Unreal Engine 4 powered role-playing game to Nintendo Switch. When Dragon Quest XI first launched on PlayStation 4, I wondered at the time what it would take to bring this to Switch. It is after all a large-scale Unreal project running at just 900p on the base PlayStation 4 system and featuring a large detailed world to explore. It certainly wasn't clear at the time how a Switch conversion could be made. The answer to this question then is not easily, but with a lot of hard work the developers have managed something rather surprising. Rest assured, the PS4 version is still visually superior, but unlike some conversions we've examined on the Switch, this version is close enough overall to the original that it manages to overcome these limitations. It really looks and feels just like Dragon Quest XI. Of course, as always, I'm sure many of you are curious to know what resolution the game offers. As a reminder, the base PS4 version is 900p, while PS4 Pro runs at 3072 by 1728 using checkerboard rendering. At the time I thought it looked great, though the Pro version exhibits some noticeable ghosting, perhaps as a result of the checkerboard rendering solution. Now on Switch, the team has instead opted for a dynamic resolution system, which results in variable pixel counts. I haven't uncovered all potential resolutions necessarily, but from what I have found, it seems to hang between 720p and 792p with occasional jumps to 810p. And of course it could go both higher and lower as well, but these values seem to be rather commonplace. In handheld mode then, the average resolution is 20 to 25% lower on average, with results around 540p. Sometimes it goes lower, sometimes higher, but that's the average resolution. There's no doubt that the results here are rather soft and a tad blurry at times, but it's a far sight better than many other Unreal-powered games on Switch, and even first-party titles running on custom engines, such as Xenoblade Chronicles 2, run at a much lower resolution overall, especially in portable mode. But there's a lot more going on besides this, and we have a pretty good idea why. The developers presented some of the details at Unreal Fest East 2019 recently, which goes into depth on what has changed. But honestly, most of these changes are evident by eye. Before we begin though and jump into the comparisons, I should note one thing: the camera positioning and field of view differ between PS4 and Switch, so it's not always possible to perfectly match the gameplay point of view. Cutscenes and battle sequences, however, do line up perfectly. Okay, to begin then, the overall polygon count has been reduced, and this is perhaps one of the most significant changes. Right from the opening scene, look closely at character details and you'll notice that edges are less rounded overall on the Switch version. It doesn't immediately stand out, mind you, when playing normally, but it is clearly evident when comparing with the PlayStation 4 original. The same is true of overall scene geometry as well, which receives slight simplification in many areas. What we're looking at is basically an adjustment to a huge range of models within the game to reduce the overall geometry budget on Switch, but it's done in a way that isn't overly distracting. It seems that they relied on Simplygon to help with the task, but ultimately much of the work was done by hand, carefully adjusting models to fit the new performance and data size targets. Reducing mesh complexity helps in this area. Speaking of data size, the game's install profile was reduced significantly from over 30 gigabytes on PlayStation 4 to just under 14 gigabytes on the Switch. Despite this, the Switch version still manages to include dual spoken language options and additional content. So how was this achieved? Well, for one thing, the pre-rendered movie files used from time to time have been re-encoded using VP9, allowing for a lower bitrate while retaining quality comparable to H.264. The current version of Unreal Engine now supports different codecs that perhaps were not available at the original time of development, so this definitely helps in terms of saving space. Furthermore, texture quality has been reduced all around. It's clearly evident when viewed side by side with the PS4 original. Surfaces are now lacking in finer details on the Switch. You can see it here as well. And here. Due to the lower overall resolution and visual style, however, it doesn't detract hugely from the presentation. So it helps keep file size down while reducing memory requirements, and it doesn't look bad, though it's definitely a step down. Shadow quality has also been dialed back on the Switch, with lower resolution shadow maps all around and less refined details on characters' self-shadows and the like. The distance in which shadows are drawn has also been reduced. Beyond that, ambient occlusion has been reduced in quality, while screen space reflections have been eliminated entirely, as you can see here in this dungeon scene. Or inside the castle. The most obvious change, however, lies in distant object rendering. Major changes were made to the distance in which detailed objects are drawn. Trees, for instance, rely heavily on billboards now on Switch, or flat objects designed to represent distant trees. As you get closer to these trees, it will gradually fade in a more detailed model in its place. This is used heavily in the overworld area to reduce overall scene complexity. Grass is also reduced in density and draw distance. This also applies to objects and characters which appear within closer proximity to the player compared to the PS4 version. It's especially evident in scenes like this, where a lot of detail is seemingly absent on Switch, though in this scene the shadow map placement is also different. LOD pop-in is an issue on all versions, but it's most distracting in the world map. Most other areas, though, are acceptable enough, even if it's not quite on the level of PS4. Furthermore, things like loading times do not suffer in this version, a problem which we've encountered often with Switch versions of games. Moving between bespoke areas is quick, while entering and exiting battle is every bit as fast as the original PlayStation version. It may not seem like a big deal in terms of development duties, but this undoubtedly required a huge amount of work to pull off, while also keeping in mind the reduced file size. Lighting is another interesting point of discussion, at least briefly. You see, a lot of the subtle lighting, especially on character models, appears to have been modified greatly on the Switch, resulting in a very different looking presentation at points. It looks fine on its own, but it does become noticeable if you start comparing the game with the PS4 version. In addition, some of the effects work has been changed as well. Motion blur is featured in some scenes on Switch, just like on PS4. But it's absent in others for some reason. How curious. Looking through the presentation on the game that the developers produced, I was also fascinated to learn that the team had desired to make the jump to Enlighten for its global illumination solution on Switch, but were unfortunately unable to do so in time. The Switch version instead sticks with Unreal's built-in light mask GI, which requires you to bake your lighting before checking the results. In comparison, Enlighten allows for real-time lighting preview via the editor. Since it's clear that the lighting has been modified since the PS4 original, I have to wonder if using Enlighten could have produced more striking results in the end. The same presentation also discusses changes made to the codebase itself, basically reducing the reliance on Unreal's blueprints and instead working to nativize code where possible, among various other things. So, on the face of it, there's a lot of changes here and certainly a loss in quality across the board, but what makes this an excellent conversion lies in how well it has been implemented. All these nips and tucks are expertly executed in a way to avoid major distraction. It still very much looks like the original, and doesn't make as many sacrifices as some other conversions we've seen on the platform. It's this balance which really works in its favor to deliver something that still looks really nice. And the Switch version even gains a number of features as well. I already mentioned the addition of both English and Japanese voice acting, which is impressive given the reduction in file size. But the soundtrack has been overhauled using new orchestral versions of the original tunes, which means this PS4 track now sounds like this on Switch. Quite the difference, huh? This doesn't apply to every track, mind you, but most of the game utilizes these orchestrated versions. That said, I'm not a fan of all the compositions in the game, though I do appreciate how the battle music sort of sounds like 60s Batman. Works for me. Beyond the music then, the Switch version includes 2D graphics that were originally featured in the 3DS version of the game. Only this time, it's a secondary mode. Essentially, you can play Dragon Quest XI entirely using these 16-bit style pixel art graphics. It's certainly an interesting idea. The game displays at 60 frames per second while in this mode, just as you would expect from a 16-bit game, though cutscene sequences do seem to update at half rate. When using this mode, the game also switches to using a random encounter system, much like the original 16 and 8-bit games. And when you engage in battle, the game switches to a first-person style view more in line with the original games. On top of this, all the map layouts, which are loosely based on the 3D game, feel somewhat unique and different as a result of the changes made here. It's a surprisingly fun way to play the game. My only complaint centers on the text boxes and HUD elements, which are rendered using the same higher resolution fonts and graphics as the 3D version, which just ends up feeling like a mismatch in style. I would have preferred a lower resolution pixel font that was more appropriate for 16-bit style visuals, but oh well, it's still a great little bonus. So with all that in mind, the Switch version really is a great place to play, with lots of extra features, some cool new options, and visuals that are surprisingly comparable to the PS4 original. Plus, of course, the vastly improved soundtrack. It's a great version of Dragon Quest XI all around, but what about performance? Well, this part of the video may not be quite as interesting as what's come before it, but that's actually good news for this port. You see, most of the game runs smoothly. You'll spend most of your time exploring the world in full 3D, and it's here where Dragon Quest XI-S seems to hold 30 frames per second most of the time. You may encounter a rare dip here or there, often due to I/O access, but for the most part it's stable. They basically managed to match the original PlayStation 4 version in terms of overall performance, which I think is rather impressive, all things considered. That said, there are a few blemishes here and there. It's not entirely frame rate related, I suppose, but if you look at distant enemies in the city like this guy walking here, you'll note that they update at half rate, a technique we've seen in other games this generation to help keep performance up. The frame rate isn't flawless when engaged in battle either. I noticed occasional 16 millisecond spikes, as well as minor dips during most battles, including these rather simple ones here on the world map. It's subtle enough as to not feel distracting, but it is there if you know what to look for. The same is true of handheld mode, which exhibits the same issues when engaged in battle, but thankfully it's perfectly smooth while exploring the overworld, just like we saw in docked mode. and it's in handheld mode that I typically prefer playing this game. The smaller screen helps conceal some of the visual artifacts, and it just looks and feels really nice. It's one of the most impressive JRPGs we've seen on a mobile platform. Of course, when thinking about performance, it's best to always keep in mind that this is a very, very, very long game, and it's entirely possible that sections later in the game may exhibit some frame rate drops here and there, but at least based on the hours that I've played it, I suspect it will mostly be fine. So yeah, Dragon Quest XI on Switch is a remarkably impressive port overall, and I'm glad that regular viewers of Digital Foundry recommended that we check it out, despite its release date back in September. I feel it's up there with other high-end Switch ports like Doom, and in some ways goes even further as it compares more favorably to the PlayStation 4 original release. The game itself has its limitations and flaws, no doubt, but I feel it's a great Dragon Quest game that is very well suited to a portable platform like the Switch. You can stick it into sleep mode, pick it up and play anywhere you want, and it just works brilliantly as a result. Now, if you step back and look at each individual piece, yes, the drop in quality is certainly evident in comparison to the original release, but I think it works better here than in, say, The Witcher 3 or Wolfenstein 2, where there was a huge loss in image quality and detail compared to the other console versions. This also bodes rather well for future Unreal Engine projects on the Switch. The development team updated to a more recent version of the engine, importing the game, and Epic itself is no doubt constantly evolving and optimize it to further improve console support. That's gonna do it for this video though. If you enjoyed it, as always, be sure to like and subscribe, ring the notification bell at the top, and of course, follow us over on Twitter. And until next time, this is John signing off.